From the macabre minds of Laughing Devil Production comes another story from the Nightshade Diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind, amp up your imagination, and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. The Moaning Cave. The following account of the haunting of the Moaning Cave in Argyll is based on a traditional ghost story of that county in the Ladies' Cabinet. Mr. George McCready set out on horseback one day from his home in Inverary for Glen Shiel, where his uncle and Miss Flora McAllister, to whom he was engaged to be married, both lived. It was a long and intricate journey in those days, necessitating putting up for the night at inns on the way. He had gotten within about 20 miles of his destination when he met one of his friends, who told him that there was a shorter route to Glen Shiel than the one which he was proposing to pursue, but that he would not advise him to take it, as it would lead him past a cavern called the Moaning Cave, on account of certain strange sounds issuing nightly from it, that were no doubt explainable on quite natural grounds, but which the people in the locality attributed to evil spirits. In such dread is the Moaning Cave held, his friend added, that no one will ever go near it alone after nightfall. McCready decided to go by the longer route. He parted with his friend at a spot where several roads met and rode on alone. He kept thinking of a dream which he had had recently. It was this. He fancied that he was on a wide stretch of wasteland strewn with great fantastically shaped rocks that were all gazing fixedly at him with heavily lidded eyes. Their black grotesque shadows stood out with uncanny clearness on the moonlit soil. There were no trees, no shrubs, no vegetation of any kind, only rocks. Facing him was the yawning mouth of a cave, and in the middle of it was a great black rock, bearing a strange and startling resemblance to a face, all the features of which were clearly defined. The strangeness of the face was indescribable. It did not belong to this world, but to a world inhabited by spirits possessing powers and qualities beyond the ken of human beings. A feeling of the utmost awe stole over McCready as he stood looking at the face. It terrified yet fascinated him, and while he stood staring at it, too spellbound to move, he heard ghastly moaning which seemed to come from the cave, and eerie whispering voices, some of them bidding him to go at once, and others telling him to stay. He awoke with the sounds lingering in his ears. His mind was so engrossed in recollecting his dreams that he did not heed the course he was pursuing, until the stumbling of his horse in a small hollow broke the chain of his thoughts. He glanced around him and realized that he had gone astray and deviated into a sort of wild pasture land. There was no sign of any high road, only the rough, stony track along which he had been traveling, apparently for some time. He felt impelled to press forward. The further he advanced, the wilder and more desolate grew the scenery. There were no longer any trees, only gaunt, naked rocks that cast queer, dark shadows onto the bare ground. They reminded him very unpleasantly of the fantastically shaped rocks which he had seen in his dream. Presently he descried what he was now expecting to see, the yawning mouth of a cave. His horse came to an abrupt halt, and it was only with the greatest difficulty that he could induce it to proceed. As he drew near, he heard, coming seemingly from it, the same fitful, unearthly moaning that he had heard in his sleep, and at the entrance of the cave, in the exact position which it had occupied in his dreams, was the rock with the indescribably strange, dread-inspiring face. The brilliant moonlight threw every feature into startling relief. There was nothing to indicate its sex, but if it had any sex, he felt that the sex was feminine rather than masculine. It had the same extraordinary, irresistible attraction for him that it had had in his dream, and he was urging his frightened horse to draw nearer to it when a voice from somewhere behind him called out, "Come away from there." He turned around and saw a man on a white horse. "Don't go any nearer to that cave," the man said. "It's the Moaning Cave." The powerful magnetic influence of the rock abruptly ceased. Its face no longer fascinated, It was just a rocky semblance, a crude caricature of a face. He drew away from it sharply and joined the horseman, who told him about the evil spirits that were believed to haunt the cave and showed him the road to Glen Shiel. He arrived safely at his uncle's house. The date of his marriage to Flora McAllister was fixed. A week prior to it he dreamed again about the Moaning Cave. The second dream was even more vivid than the first dream. In it he found himself once again in front of the great black rock, which stood in the yawning mouth of the Moaning Cave. The peculiar beauty of the face fascinated and enchanted him, to an even greater extent than it had done before, and he was gazing adoringly at it when he saw something in its eyes that terrified him. He tried to run, but found to his dismay that he was rooted to the ground. "Promise that you will return here in 7 days," a voice said, "and you will be allowed to depart." Frantic to escape, he promised, whereupon the bonds that had held him limb-tied slackened, and he awoke. The clock on the landing outside his room struck 2. Exactly a week later, a few minutes before 2 o'clock in the morning, he was seen galloping madly towards the Moaning Cave. Later in the day, members of the wedding party, who were anxiously searching for the absent bridegroom, found his dead body lying in the ground in front of the great black rock. He had kept his promise. The Black Cave of Death. Many legends and traditional stories of ghostly phenomena are still current among the inhabitants of the Hebrides. Ig is wild and romantic without being perhaps what is generally considered extremely picturesque. The cataract and the mountain stream harmonize well with the crude and rugged scenery. The occasional scream of an eagle accords with a place where everything around is wildly magnificent. Adjoining Ig is a small island which contains the Black Cave of the MacDonalds. The entrance to it is very narrow, but the interior is capacious, and according to the popular belief prevalent in the western island, is periodically very badly haunted. Terrible cries of agony are heard, and gruesome lights and fearful forms are seen by anyone who is bold enough to enter the cave alone during the night. The following legend is supposed to furnish an explanation for the haunting. When a clan of the MacDonalds possessed Ig, the little island close beside it served as a kind of out-farm where the cattle were pastured during the summer months, and it was the duty of the fair daughters of the MacDonalds to proceed thither for the purpose of milking the kine. One evening a joyous party had concluded this work and were amusing themselves on the greensward, when harmless but boisterous mirth, when the sound of a pibroch was heard at some distance. The sounds of laughter ceased, and the girls listened attentively. "It is a young chieftain," said Mary, "who has come in old Allen's boat to take us home," and her eyes, bright and blue, glistened with animation as she spoke, for Mary, the fairest of Ig's charming daughters, was beloved by the young MacDonald. Her gay companions were of the same opinion, and snatching up their milk pails, they hastened toward the shore. They had not advanced far when the music sounded nearer to them, and as they turned the angle of a projecting rock, their astonished eyes encountered not the well-known plaid of the MacDonalds, but the dark tartan of the McLeods. With wild screams they dashed their vessels on the ground and fled, but though terror lent them a momentary energy, their speed was unavailing. A dozen Highlanders quickly overtook them, and their chief held the frightened Mary in his arms. "Unhand me, dark chief of the MacLeod," she cried. "You and the MacDonalds seldom meet but on the brown moor foot to foot, and your hands seldom grasp each other save in the grasp of death. You once met on the road heaths of Mornish." "That is true," MacLeod said. "We met as you say, but your chieftain was surrounded by hundreds of his followers. And did I not hear you shrieking when their dirks drew my blood in torrents? I bore you to the greensward, where, faint with the loss of blood and reeling with the deep, dark gashes on my brow, I sank to the ground, and when my dizzy senses awoke you were gone. The sea danced brightly on the prows that bore you off, and I lay cold and stiffened in my gore. But now, girl, you are mine. Your chieftain is not here, and were he here, he should not tear you from me." In the meantime the MacDonalds were congregated round the wassail bowl. Each of them grew more clamorous as the liquor circulated, and they were planning a predatory expedition to the mainland, when Allen, the aged boatman, rushed into the building, exclaiming, "Death to the MacLeods!" "Death to the MacLeods!" the clansmen shouted, starting to their feet, while every man had his hand on his claymore. "Death to the MacLeods!" Allen exclaimed again. "They have seized the daughters of Ig." "Not Mary!" the young chief of the MacDonalds ejaculated. "Speak, Allen. Has Mary fallen into their hands?" Allen nodded. "Going, as I was wont, to the island to bring home the maidens, I heard cries of distress, and espied the dark tartan of the Mixclouds." "That's enough!" the chief exclaimed. "Say no more." In a few minutes the strait between the two islands was covered with the boats of the MacDonalds. It was not yet evening, and the Mixclouds were still on the little island. When they saw their hereditary enemies approaching, their minstrels started to sing their war song, and a fierce encounter soon commenced. The MacDonalds triumphed, and the chief of the Mixclouds was among the slain. On the return of the victorious MacDonalds to Eigg with the girls they had rescued, there was great rejoicing, which was interrupted by the advent of a fleet of Mixclouds, who were thirsting for revenge. The MacDonalds fought gallantly again, overwhelming numbers, and were forced to retire to the little island near Eigg. There they sought refuge in the Black Cave, where they were besieged by the exulting Mixclouds, who declared that they would all be killed unless they surrendered their young chief. "Let my blood appease their wrath," the chief of the MacDonalds said. "Think of your wives and children." But his clansmen cried, "No, we all die together." The Mixclouds lit a huge fire at the mouth of the cave. The MacDonalds attempted to rush out of the cave, but the entrance was too small to give egress to more than one at a time, and those who had the temerity to venture out were quickly dispatched by the claymores of the Mixclouds. The smoke from the fire, blown by the wind, penetrated to the innermost recesses of the cave. There was no escape from it. The suffocating MacDonalds grew desperate. Their cries of anguish were dreadful. The Mixclouds mocked them and heaped additional fuel on the fire. Gradually the cries and groans grew fainter and fainter, and finally ceased. Every MacDonald within the cave was dead, and ever since that time the cave has been haunted by their ghosts and the ghost of the cruel Mixclouds. Hill and Moor Ghosts. Robert Hunt, in his popular romances of the west of England, writes about the Gump in Cornwall, which he says has long been the playground of the little people, some of them whom were cruel. An old St. Just man, who had been told that there was treasure on the Gump, resolved to get some of it. He stole towards the place one night when there was a harvest moon, and was joined by a dark shadow, which moved along by his side on the moonlit road. When he drew near to the Gump, he heard ravishing music, slow and solemn and quick and gay. It moved him from tears to laughter, and in spite of his age he could not refrain from dancing to it. It surrounded him and seemed to come from beneath the surface of the ground. Eventually there was a startling crash, and the hill opened before him. An amazing sight met his astonished and dazzled eyes. He saw everywhere variously colored lights. Every blade of grass was hung with lamps. Every bush was illuminated. An army of musicians emerged from the opening in the hills, followed by a troop of soldiers with an immense banner. At their heels came hundreds of Spriggans, who crowded round the old man. Next came a crowd of little creatures. Some of them were laden with vessels of silver and gold, and goblets covered with precious stones. Others brought the most delicious food and wine, which they placed on golden tables. When they had finished preparing a splendid banquet, out of the hill trooped very many lovely ladies, arrayed in glittering costly robes, accompanied by an equal number of richly apparelled men. The music appeared to give new life to all the old man's senses. His sight became clearer, his hearing better, and his sense of smell much keener. The fragrance of flowers filled the air. When all the lovely ladies and their escorts were seated, a signal was given by the most magnificently attired of all the males, who wore a crown and was addressed as Prince, and the feasting commenced. The old St. Just man, who was watching the scene with covetous eyes, stealthily approached the Prince and the Princess, whose jewels were the most brilliant of any of the ladies present. The old man's mouth watered as he looked at them. He came nearer and nearer to the royal couple, and was about to clap his large old hat over them. They were both tiny, when there was a shrill whistle. The music at once ceased, the banqueters and banquet vanished. The lights were extinguished, and everywhere was dark. The old man tried to move, but he was on his back, bound hand and foot. He tried to shout, but he was tongue-tied. Nasty, crawling creatures ran over him, and the thongs that held them caused him the greatest agony. He lay in this state until the day had dawned, when the thongs loosened. He shook himself and was free. He rose wet, cold, hungry, and no little ashamed. Sulkily and slowly, for he was very stiff, he made his way home. He never ventured to the Gump again, even in the daylight. A vicar named Iago of Wendron in Cornwall was believed by his parishioners to have intercourse with the devil. They were all afraid of him and declared that he had second sight and could cast spells on anyone who offended him. He could detect a thief and liar by merely looking at them. People used to see him at crossroads and lonely spots at night, conversing with the evil spirits that haunted those places. The very horse on which he rode, a huge black animal, was said to possess supernatural powers, and to be able to appear and disappear in the most unaccountable and alarming manner. Dartmoor has its mischievous pixies, who lead people astray and steal things from houses. Probably the best known of the Dartmoor ghosts is the phantom black hound, which some people still believe to be the spirit of Lady Howard, earthbound on account of her many bad deeds. The hound haunts the road between Tavistock and Oakhampton, and brings misfortune to whoever sees it. There have been at various times rumors of phantom houses, phantom horses, and phantom dogs on Dartmoor, in addition to the black hound. Exmoor also has its ghost. A road between Exford and Porlock has such a sinister reputation that few people care to walk along it alone at night. The ghost of a man who murdered his child haunts one part of Exmoor, and terrifies all who encounter it to such a degree that they are ill for a long time afterwards. The ghost of a farmer who drowned himself at Pinkworth Pond is said to haunt the neighbourhood of the pond, and entail bad luck on all who encounter it. Westcote, in his view of Devonshire, says a barrow near Chalancombe is haunted, and that anyone interfering with the barrow has always met with serious misfortune. There was formerly a similar superstition in connection with barrows, which were called the graves of the giants, in Somerset. It was thought wicked to disturb them, and that anyone doing so would fall ill and probably die. The same belief prevailed in the southwest of Ireland. At Castlehaven, near Bandon in County Cork, there are 7 large menhirs, none of which can be removed without incurring the death of the person making the attempt. A labourer who was ordered to remove one of the stones was crushed to death by it. It was forthwith restored to its original position. About 1 mile from Brewtown there is a hill called Creek, which is one of the highest hills in Somerset. The view from its summit is very extensive. People who have been there have asserted that they have been able to see vessels in the Bristol Channel at a distance of 30 miles. The base of Creek Hill is surrounded by a spacious area of several acres, which not so very long ago was inhabited by hares and even badgers. Many stories have been circulated from time to time about very alarming and harmful supernatural phenomena on the hill, and in the land adjoining it. About the year 1849, color was given to these rumors by the discovery of 2 human skeletons, laid transversely towards each other. They were unearthed by labourers who were engaged in excavating stone in a quarry at the foot of Creek Hill. On being disturbed, the skeletons crumbled into dust at once. It was conjectured that the place where they were found was the scene of a battle between the men of Somerset and the Normans, and that the 2 skeletons were those of men who had fallen in the conflict. Be that as it may, the haunting is said to have continued after the discovery of the bones. A workman passing by the hill on his way home one night was nearly scared to death by a tall figure that rushed past him and seemed to dive into the earth after he had gone a few yards. On another occasion, a farmer who was passing by the hill at night saw someone lying on the ground. Wondering if the person was ill or had met with an accident, the farmer approached the recumbent figure and was about to speak to it when it suddenly vanished. The next moment he heard loud peals of mocking, diabolical laughter, and was so terrified that he took to his heels and never ceased running until he arrived at his farm. All the way there he heard footsteps bounding along after him. When he was in the farmyard he looked behind him and saw a tall shadowy form bounding away in the direction of Creek Hill. Haunted bridges. One of the worst haunted bridges in Great Britain is the Ponty Glen between Corwen and Seraphy Druan in Wales. Situated in a picturesque glen, it spans a lovely mountain stream. In olden days the glen was the headquarters of a band of atrocious robbers who robbed and murdered travelers, sparing neither women nor children. It was after they had been hunted down and exterminated that the glen and the bridge were haunted. People who ventured to cross the Ponty Glen after nightfall heard unearthly screams and demoniacal laughter, and saw phantoms of frightful shapes that resembled nothing in this world and emanated evil. No dog or horse would go on the bridge except under compulsion. More than one person who saw the ghost either went mad or died from fright. The haunting of the glen and bridge continued to at least the end of the last century. A bailiff was returning one night from Corwin to his home near Ruthin, when he saw a female dressed in a Welsh costume, seated on a heap of stones in the Ponty Glen. He wished her good night. She made no reply, but rose and walked away, increasing in stature the further she went, until she became colossal, when she vanished. The bailiff never ventured near the bridge alone again at night. Wales is not the monopoly of haunted bridges. Ireland has several. There is one in Wicklow. The river Liffey rises 1 mile south of the upper lake of Bray, rushes through the glen of Kipure, and reaches a place where the glen narrows and becomes precipitous. The river then glides smoothly on until it plunges from a great height into a circular pool believed to be fathomless. The pool and a bridge in near proximity to it were for many years believed to be haunted by evil spirits of the most frightful shapes, which delighted in terrifying people and urging them to commit suicide and murder. Near the little town of Nenagh there is a bridge over a shallow stream that sometimes becomes dry in the summer. The bridge and the stream are reputed to be haunted. One day, about the middle of the last century, a farmer was returning home from the fair at Nenagh in an unusually gay mood, for he had met several of his cronies at the fair and had had jovial time with them. As he approached the bridge he saw a white object, no bigger than his hat, gliding along the road by his side. When he reached the bridge his horse stopped short. He dismounted and tried to lead the horse over the bridge, but it recoiled, snorted, and trembled violently. It was a bright moonlit night, and the farmer, chafed by the horse's obstinacy, and seeing nothing to account for it, lost his patience with the poor animal, and plied his whip and spur in earnest, using very bad language. All of a sudden the horse shot forward, and the farmer saw very clearly, standing on the bridge, the tall shadowy form of a woman in black. As he passed her, she struck him on the shoulder. The blow threw him forward upon the neck of his horse, which in wild terror reached the door of his house at a mad gallop, and stood there quivering and steaming all over. He was very faint and ill, and got into the house with great difficulty. He begged his sons to summon a priest at once. When his wife and daughter were getting him to bed, they saw distinctly the marks of 5 fingers on the flesh of his shoulder, where the spectre had struck him. Those marks, which resembled in tint the hue of a body struck by lightning, remained imprinted on his flesh and were buried with him. From the moment he returned home that night, he was a scared, silent, broken-spirited man. It was early summer then. He died before the close of the year. This is a well-known story. I heard it when I was a boy, and reference is made to it in All the Year Round. The old Brigadoon is not the only haunted bridge in Scotland. For many years after the great Tay Bridge catastrophe, there were rumors of ghostly phenomena in the place where it happened. The disaster occurred during the night of December 28, 1879, when there was the worst hurricane ever known in Scotland. It struck the bridge furiously and swept away about 420 yards of it, shortly before the train from Edinburgh to Dundee, with 70 passengers, reached the bridge. There was no warning of the damage done to the bridge. The train raced on to the bridge at great speed, and on reaching the fatal gap, plunged down into the raging river. Not a soul was saved. I was a very little boy at the time, but I well recollect hearing about the disaster very soon after it happened. According to rumor, a ghostly reenaction of the appalling catastrophe took place for many years. It was always on the anniversary of the tragedy. The following is a description of it by an alleged eyewitness. One dark, bitterly cold December night in the 80s of the last century, the narrator, at the time of the occurrence a young businessman, was waiting with a friend in a sheltered spot close to the scene of the disaster, to see if the reports about the haunting were really true. About the hour when the catastrophe occurred, they heard the dull murmur of an approaching train. The murmur speedily grew into the hoarse roar of an express train. As the train drew nearer, the roar became louder and louder. The whistle sounded shrill and piercing. There was a flash of lurid light, a still louder roar as the phantom train sped past the 2 awe-stricken spectators onto the phantom bridge. A few moments later there were the most appalling screams, succeeded by a silence, broken only by the fitful murmuring of the wind and the increasing monotone of the electric wires. The narrator and his friend, who were very badly frightened, hastened home, but did not recover from the scare they had experienced for many days. After the tragic ending of the beautiful and promising young actress, Peg Entwistle, the Arroyo Seco Bridge over a canyon near Hollywood was rumored to be haunted by an evil spirit that urged people to commit suicide. Over 60 people have leapt from the bridge to their terrible death, and the majority of them have been unsuccessful Hollywood actresses. Lastly, there is the Alponte alla Carraia in Florence, which is haunted by a phantom black goat, believed to be the spirit of a man named Marocchio who led a very evil life, and on account of his many sins was condemned to haunt the bridge until doomsday. Those who see the goat invariably experience grave misfortunes and are sometimes prompted to kill themselves or kill other people. The Brockley Combe Ghosts. Brockley Combe, a romantic wooded glen in Somersetshire, is one of the numerous beauty spots within a few miles of Bristol, and is easily accessible by road from that city. The loftiness of the trees with their gnarled trunks and fantastically shaped branches, the richness of the shrubs and varied hue of the lofty rocks flanking either side of the glen render it as a favorite resort of lovers of nature and picnickers. A winding uphill road runs through the combe. In the daytime, when the glen is aglow with sunshine and echoing with the merry voices of adults and children, the idea of its harboring anything so terrifying as ghosts seems incredible. But in the dead of night, when the combe is darkened by the shadows of the great rocks and tall trees, and there is a sepulchral silence, broken only by the occasional hooting and wailing of night birds, the place assumes a different character, and any one who is at all imaginative or psychic can well believe that it is haunted. The combe has long borne a reputation for being visited at times by evil denizens of another world. There are many stories relative to the haunting. One story is as follows. Some gypsies spending one early autumn night in the glen were startled by the sound of a heavy vehicle coming along the road at a great rate. Several of the younger members of the tribe, urged by curiosity, peered through the foliage bordering the road. To their surprise, they saw careening towards them a hearse-like coach drawn by 4 black horses. As the coach drew nearer, their astonishment turned to terror when they perceived that the driver lacked a head. They did not wait for a closer inspection, but fled. Another story about the phantom coach relates to Mr. Benjamin Brown of Birmingham. Brown, who was visiting friends near Brockley, ridiculed the notion of the combe being haunted. "Ghosts?" he scoffed. "There aren't any such things, and if there were, it would take more than a score of them to scare Ben Brown." Cigarette in mouth, his hat stuck jauntily on one side of his well-oiled head, he strolled casually one night to the combe. A church clock solemnly sounded midnight as he entered the glen. Not a soul was about. Not a sound was to be heard. The silence of the grave greeted his advent. His bravado diminished, but as yet only slightly, and he strolled on. Armed with a few stones, he crept behind a tree that overlooked the road. Presently he heard the rumbling of heavy wheels and the pattering of hoofs. He held a stone ready to throw at the coach. "I'm not afraid, not I," he muttered, but his teeth chattered. As the vehicle passed by him, he hurled the stone with all his might. To his dismay, it was not the phantom coach, but a wagonette containing a football team, returning from a late evening's jollification from a gallant victory. The stone narrowly missed the driver, who stopped the wagonette. Brown ran for his life. The footballers, with shouts of anger, tore after him. Brown was no sprinter, and the footballers were overtaking him when, bound a bend in the road, came a sinister hearse-like vehicle drawn by 4 black horses. This time it was the phantom coach. The footballers fled in one direction and Brown in another. When Brown arrived at the house of his friends, all his breath was gone, and his skepticism regarding ghosts was gone too. A third story relating to the phantom coach is about a cyclist. A young cyclist was riding a push bicycle through Brockley Combe one autumn night when he encountered the much dreaded phantom coach. It appeared so suddenly and came down the sloping road so quickly that before he could move aside out of its way, it was on him. He was not conscious of contacting anything solid. A current of icy air seemed to pass right through his body, and he found himself stretched on the ground. It was some moments before he was able to rise and continue on his journey. He had received no physical injury, but his nerves were seriously affected. The Brockley Combe phantom coach has that effect on people. It shatters their nervous system. Another phantom said to haunt the combe is that of a parson of very evil repute. 2 gentlemen, a doctor and a clergyman, were driving through the glen one fine May night. Suddenly the horse became very restless and evinced signs of most unusual nervousness. It seemed to want to stop and then to turn. It quickened its pace and moved nearer to one side of the road. The doctor, wondering what was causing the horse to behave in such an odd manner, peered around and saw walking a little ahead of him, in the center of the road, a tall figure in a long black cloak which reached nearly to the ground. The doctor, who was in sound health, stared at the figure and wondered if it was an optical illusion. There was something very peculiar and unreal about it. The clergyman, who heard him muttering to himself, inquired if he was addressing the phantom. "Do you see what I have seen for the last few minutes?" the doctor said. "Yes," the clergyman replied. "The figure of a man in a long black cloak. Speak cheerfully to the horse, or it may stampede. It's getting very restless." When they came to a wider part of the road, in the center of which was a triangular patch of turf, bare and treeless, the figure disappeared. The doctor, who was almost out of breath from his attempts to pacify and restrain the horse, said he thought the figure had gone to the right of the patch of turf. "It went neither to the right nor to the left," the clergyman said. "It faded right away and vanished. I was watching it intently. It was not of this world." The horse, which had been so uneasy, was now quite calm and tractable. It took them to their destination without any mishap. It was never again, however, the same horse. It had always been docile and easy to manage, but after that night in the combe it was very timid, nervous, and restless. According to Betsy Prodgen, who was born in Brockley about the beginning of the last century, the ghost in the long black cloak is that of Reverend John Herbertson, a reputed very wicked rector, who lived in the neighborhood of Brockley Combe. In the year 1776, Mr. James Stevens, a gentleman of independent means who lived not far from Brockley Combe, was injured by a fall from a tree in the glen. Mr. Herbertson happened to witness the accident, and thinking that he saw a way to benefit by it, he provided means for removing Mr. Stevens to the latter's home at Shelby. Mr. Stevens was known to have amassed considerable wealth before he retired from business, and Mr. Herbertson determined to get some of his money. With that object in view, Mr. Herbertson took into his confidence an old college friend, whom he knew to be as unscrupulous as he was himself. The two rogues paid daily visits to the bedside of Mr. Stevens, exhibiting the deepest concern at his injury. They completely deceived him, and contrived through their artifice to obtain his signature to a will drawn up by themselves. They were his sole beneficiaries. Mr. Stevens died soon after signing the will. Neither Mr. Herbertson nor his friend lived long enough to enjoy their ill-gotten wealth. Mr. Herbertson was said to be in league with the devil and to practice black magic in Brockley Combe in the dead of night. The night he died, a tall shadowy figure, neither human nor animal, but a terrifying mixture of both, was seen to enter the rectory. Shrieks were heard coming from within the house, and it was firmly believed that the devil or one of his demons had come for the rector's sin-laden soul. His ghost, clad in a long black cloak, closely resembling the garment which he wore in his lifetime, was seen in Brockley Combe soon after his death, and it is rumoured to have appeared there within the last few years. Yet another ghost haunts the combe. It is that of an old woman who lived in a cottage near the combe, and was murdered in or close to it about the year 1812. Her appearance are the forerunners of misfortune to those who witness them. Fortunately, they are rare. The Mysteries of Saddell and Nightpath Glen. Legends and traditionary tales cluster around the castle and monastery of Saddell in Kintyre. The legend relating to the monastery, now in ruins, is as follows. Somerled, the famous Thane of Argyll and Lord of Kintyre, murdered his stepfather and was haunted by his ghost. He travelled to Rome and confessed his crime to the Pope, who told him that he would continue to be haunted until he built a holy house between two hills and two waters. Saddell being the only place that in his knowledge answered to this description, he went there and founded a Cistercian monastery. The ghost never tormented him again. He did not live to see the completion of the building. It was completed by his son, Reginald, who assumed the title of king. In the cemetery of the monastery are the graves of Archibald Campbell of Carradale, who was killed at the Battle of Inverlochy, and some of the MacDonalds. The MacDonalds used to visit the O'Neills of Tyrone and the O'Donnells of Tyrconnell, and on one occasion Roig Finaggle MacDonald returned from Ireland with the wife of one of the Irish chieftains. Her aggrieved husband followed her to Saddell, where he was seized by MacDonald and starved to death in a dungeon in Saddell Castle. 3 of his friends came over from Ireland to seek redress from MacDonald, who received them with every show of friendliness and hospitality, and while they were sleeping cut off their heads. The King of Scotland heard of this and ordered MacDonald to appear before him. MacDonald obeyed and was compelled to swear allegiance to the king. Directly he got back to Saddell Castle, he defied the king with impunity, and nothing was done. After the crimes that he had perpetrated, Sadell Castle was reputed to be haunted by the ghosts of his victims, and after his death by his ghost. The Sadell Monastery, which has long been in ruins, is haunted likewise by more than one grisly spectre. A servant maid of a farmer who lived in Glen Bar, 7 miles from Sadell, fell in love with the son of her employer. To get rid of her, the farmer told her that if she would cross the hills to Sadell Monastery on a dark, stormy night and bring back the skull from the tomb of the founder, he would permit her to marry his son. He never imagined that the girl would dare to venture on such an expedition. To his intense surprise, however, she set off to Sadell in the night when there was a heavy snowstorm, and returned in the morning, half dead with fatigue, but with a skull in her hand. She said that when she got to the monastery she found the door open. She groped her way to the founder's tomb and was terrified on hearing mysterious sounds all around her. She found the skull, and on her way back to the door was pursued by invisible forms. She got out of the building and closed the door behind her. As she did so there was a rushing sound and something crashed against it. She did not know how she ever got back to Glen Bar. She had the skull and claimed the promised reward. The farmer doubted the veracity of her tale. He did not believe that the skull she showed him came from the monastery. In order to make sure, however, he went to the monastery and sought the tomb of its founder. The skull, which always occupied a certain place on it, was no longer there. True to his word, the farmer permitted the brave maid to marry his son. Skeptics regarding the supernatural suggested that the sounds heard by the maid might have been due to the deer which lived in the grounds of the monastery and sought shelter in the building itself on wet and stormy nights. The monastery was well known, however, to harbor ghosts, so that the source of the sounds remained a mystery. The anonymous author of Ghostly Visitor gives the following harrowing account of a haunting in a glen in the rear of Nightshade Castle ruins in Peeblesshire. A lady named Hay was found horribly murdered in the glen some generations ago, and her spirit is believed still to haunt the scene of the crime. One evening, not very many years ago, an old woman was walking along the road near to the spot when she saw a head adorned with lappets, or what was formerly known as purlin, moving along the top of the wall on her left. This strange mode of progression was continued for some little time, when the head turned around and the eyes looked at her. Then appeared the body, which joined itself to the head, and both came over into the road and stood up opposite to her. So visible was the apparition that the woman distinctly saw a red line across the throat, at the sight of which she fainted. This fearful vision was also seen by a man residing in the neighbourhood, and such was the effect it produced upon him that he was ill for a fortnight. The Mocking Ghost of Whittington Common. In a letter addressed to the editor of the Barley Bridge and Stourbridge Advertiser in December 1872, the writer relates his encounter with a very alarming and unusual species of ghostly phenomena. He had been to a fair at Kinver and was crossing Whittington Common late at night on his way home. He saw a very tall, lanky figure coming towards him. It halted when a few feet from him and stood silent and motionless. He could not see its face. He struck at it with his stick. His stick encountered nothing solid. It went right through the figure, which gave a low, chuckling laugh. He struck at it again, and the same thing happened. The stick passed through the figure, which again chuckled. He became frightened. He tried to run away, but he was limp-tied, glued to the ground. The figure never moved. It remained stationary in front of him, chuckling until daybreak, when it raised its long skinny arms over its head, and with a loud peal of derisive laughter vanished. The spell which had rendered the writer of the letter paralyzed was broken, and he continued on his way to his destination. He reached it thoroughly exhausted and did not recover from his weird experience for several days. The letter is signed E.T.